Welcome back to the Dispatch podcast, Liz.
Great to be back with you guys. Always love to be on the Dispatch.
Great. So the book is really interesting to me for about 1,000 reasons. I spent a fair amount of time, reading and reporting about these events, the lead up to January 6th, the stolen election claims, January 6th itself, the aftermath, the committee. And I was talking to you about it. I was talking to a lot of other people about what was happening in real time. And I have to say, the thing that jumps out at me most about the experience of reading the book is how much we've forgotten in this short period of time. And I want to start with a really big picture question. And it's a question that I've gotten from people who are not fans of you. They might not be fans of Donald Trump, but they don't see him as the threat that you present him as in this book. So what do you say to people who say that the events of January 6th were really just a rally that spun out of control, that you and the January 6th committee have blown it up? You're obsessed with Donald Trump. He's not a would-be dictator. He's an old guy who's a narcissist and got a little carried away. What's the best response to that claim?
I think there are several things. One is to remind people that what he did, he didn't just do on January 6th or on January 5th leading up to January 6th, but that what we showed through the select committee hearings and what there is really a mountain of evidence that demonstrates is that this was an overall plan. He was trying every way he could to seize power, whether that was pressuring state legislators to turn, to switch votes for Biden to votes for Trump, whether it was pressuring the Justice Department to say that the election had been stolen, whether it was pressuring the vice president to take illegal and unconstitutional action. And then ultimately, of course, unleashing this mob on the Capitol. And he knew that the crowd was armed. He certainly knew they were angry, and then refusing to tell them to go home as this was all unfolding. So there's no question that, when Donald Trump woke up on the morning of January 6th, he expected that he would be able to stay in office. He had, put together this plan to do so, and the 6th was the culmination of those efforts. He failed. He failed because there were people around him who stopped him. But, anybody who suggests that somehow he will not attempt to stay in office beyond his term if he were to be elected again is refusing to look at what he did before. And the other thing that I think is really important is he's demonstrated his willingness to ignore the rulings of the courts. And I think that's a fundamental danger that he poses that again, people can't ignore because he's demonstrated that's exactly what he'll do.
How central was Donald Trump to these plans? I mean, was this mostly driven by Trump, or was this Donald Trump sitting in the Oval Office saying, "Hey, I don't want to leave the White House. Go do some work to try to make that happen"? How central was he to the planning of this?
He was the central figure, and certainly there were people who said to him, "Hey, you could, for example, as Mike Flynn said, deploy the military and rerun the election in key states." And we know that he didn't do that because people around him, like Eric Hirschman, Pat Cipollone, and others, were there, stepped in, and explained to him why he couldn't do that. But whether you're talking about, the incredible pressure that he personally put on the vice president, whether you're talking about his personal and direct involvement in the fake electors plot, he was on the phone with John Eastman, with Ronna McDaniel, the chair of the RNC, in this plot that was very much intended to culminate with Mike Pence refusing to count legitimate electors. And so, I hear people saying it wasn't that big a deal, and there are different elements of that. Some people say, well, gosh, the violence wasn't really all that bad, which of course, the evidence shows, and we know, and we've seen the video of that day and the horrific attack on police officers. So, that clearly is an attempt to kind of whitewash what happened. There are others who make the claim that you're making, or that you're talking about, Steve, which is, well, it's not really true that he would attempt to stay in power, that he would be a dictator. But the evidence clearly shows that that's exactly what he intended to do, and he tells us again almost every day, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's one of the things that really sort of stuck with me. There's all this talk now in the press. I mean, Bob Kagan wrote a piece in the Washington Post suggesting U.S. may be on a slippery slope to a dictatorship. There's all this talk about Trump as a would-be dictator, and the debate has really been sort of, would he do these things? Would he do the things that would be authoritarian, dictatorial, what have you? And in reading this book, in the background of this public debate, the thing that is abundantly clear and I think incontrovertible, he's already done it. Like, this isn't a theoretical debate that we're having. One of the things that really jumps out, and again, you remember these as isolated incidents as they're happening, and you look back on and you sort of remember, I don't know, at least for me, there's like this collective fog about it. He tried to basically force out or remove the leaders of the Defense Department and the leaders of the Justice Department as part of his effort to remain in power. People have debated whether this is a coup or a soft coup, or, what are the appropriate words. But when you do something like that, it's very clear that you have not only authoritarian sort of goals, you're willing to use authoritarian means.
Right. And I think that one thing that people also need to recognize is, I talk a lot about his willingness to ignore the rulings of the courts. And I think it's important to be specific about what that means. For example, imagine a situation where he concocts an emergency to get state legislatures to decide, well, you know what, we just simply can't hold the election in our state. There's been incurable fraud, so we can't send electors to Washington, or we can't certify the electors that reflect the popular vote. You can imagine a whole series of things that could be done, which he came very close to doing already. And people will say, well, yes, but the courts will step in. The federal court will order the Secretary of State of a given state or the governor of a given state to certify the electors, or to make sure that they hold the election on the day at which it's scheduled. It doesn't matter. If a court can step in and issue a compulsory order, but if the President of the United States isn't going to enforce it, who is? And I think that is where the scenarios are not unrealistic. You can certainly imagine, because, as you say, he's made clear his willingness to try to stay in power previously. And a couple of days ago, somebody said, well, how's he going to do it? Is he going to issue a tweet? What army does he have that's going to help him do it? Well, if you elect him president, he has the United States Army. And as we've seen before, his willingness, and he suggested that Mike Flynn is going to have a place in his cabinet, maybe his national security advisor. So he certainly has already demonstrated the willingness, the capacity to do these things, and ignoring that is simply willful blindness.
I want to spend a moment on Mike Johnson, the new Speaker of the House, both for insights into him, but also for what they tell us about how elected Republicans have dealt with Donald Trump and are dealing with Donald Trump. You liked Mike Johnson, considered him a friend. You were in leadership together, thought he was very smart. And then he offers this amicus brief in a Texas lawsuit challenging the election. Can you just walk us through what happened there, what his role was specifically?
Yeah, Mike was somebody that I liked very much. I thought that he was an honorable person. But then when we got to this period of time in December of 2020, and he sent around an email telling members of the House that he had this amicus brief that he wanted people to sign on to, and that he would be providing a list to Donald Trump of the names of the members of the House who signed on to it. that began a whole series of events where it became very clear to me that Mike was in fact willing to do things that he knew to be wrong. And with respect to the brief, he kept claiming that the brief was just simply laying out an argument that the court should hear the president's case, should hear the Texas case. And in fact, that's not what the brief was. The brief contained in it, with respect to 4 states, allegations of really serious fraud in the conduct of the elections in those states. And these were allegations that, had already been heard by lower courts. The courts had already ruled on them. And in addition to that, people signing on to the brief were making assertions to the Supreme Court, frankly, about facts that they had no basis to know, which I thought, in addition to everything else, presented a real ethical problem for anybody who was a member of the bar. But it also was a fundamentally unconstitutional argument, the notion that Texas could challenge the way that these other states conducted their presidential elections simply, outside of the constitutional framework. And the court, within a few hours, dismissed the case. But Johnson combined these claims. He kept asserting that he was a constitutional lawyer, conveying to the members of the conference that he had some particular expertise, and then leading them down this path. And they all bear their own responsibility for this, but his role was really destructive because he was making claims about what the brief was that weren't true, and because the brief itself was fundamentally infirm constitutionally.
And I mean, I think the thing that stands out about that episode in your telling is that he himself didn't seem to believe much of it. You write about how he conceded that you were right on the law and right about sort of the moment of peril the country was in. But then to justify what he had done, he sent you a Fox News poll and argued that he was really concerned with messaging. Is that representative of how your colleagues in the House were thinking about this at the time, that this was all about messaging, that they needed to avoid, sort of earning the wrath of Donald Trump? What was the motivation there?
Well, there are 2 points there. I think one is certainly people were worried about the wrath of Trump. They didn't want to be attacked by Trump. But secondly, this notion of, these public opinion polls show that people think the election might have been stolen. And that wasn't just Republicans in the House. Of course, we had, Republicans in the Senate, led by Ted Cruz and a number of others who signed on to his also unconstitutional proposal that there be this 10-day audit of electoral votes. And in the press release the group of Republican senators issued, they also said, we have to do this because opinion polls show that people believe the election was stolen, which, if you think about it, is a completely backwards way for elected officials to operate. Those opinion polls showed that because Donald Trump and those senators and the Republicans in the House were making the claim. People were saying, the election's been stolen. Therefore, the opinion polls showed that people were believing the lie. And then they used the fact of those opinion polls to justify additional lies. And that's how you get pretty quickly to a situation where you're operating outside bounds of the truth.
Right. Trying to solve a problem that they caused. Yeah.
Right.
At one point, you described Johnson's attitude as knowing that what he was doing was wrong, but doing it anyway and rationalizing his actions by saying, we just need to do this one last thing for Trump. And you also have a chapter in the book called, quote, "Just humor him," unquote. I can't tell you how many times I heard that in the course of my reporting on this. And, there was a famous quote, anonymous quote in the Washington Post that echoed those same sentiments. Is this the most frequent rationalization you hear for enabling Trump in this moment? This sense that sort of he's on his way out. We can just do this, not earn his wrath, and move on?
It certainly was one of the most frequent. And I think before January 6th, and both with respect to this amicus brief, but also with respect to the objections themselves. And it was Johnson's arguments about on what basis he was objecting to electoral votes, where Kevin McCarthy's own lawyer told me that she had talked to him, and he knew the arguments he was making didn't have any basis in the Constitution. But the justification, not just from him, but from many others, was, well, you know what harm can it do, really? Like, let's just do this one last thing. And I think we've seen how dangerous that is. We know now the harm that in fact can do, and led to the violence on January 6th in part. But I think in some ways now we've even moved beyond that. Now we're at a place where people are suggesting, well, it didn't really happen. He's not that bad. We ought to support him again. People who are criticizing him are exaggerating. And that's a whole sort of different, that's new territory we're in, that I think makes the likelihood that we could, sleepwalk ourselves into dictatorship not insignificant.
Yeah, you have said, and you write in the book, that Trump's reelection would mean the end of the republic. What do you do if he wins? Is the fight just over then? What happens?
Well, I don't want to contemplate a Trump victory or a post-Trump victory, because I think it's so important that we stop him. And I think we need to make sure that he is not elected in this election cycle. And then I think after we make sure he's not elected, those of us who really are conservatives, those of us who have been members of the Republican Party for a long time, have to build something else. We have to build something new. We have to recognize and admit that the Republican Party itself, I think, is pretty nearly unsalvageable, and something new has to arise, sort of out of the ashes of this Trump Republican Party.
Yeah, you have a scene in the book where you're in Kevin McCarthy's office, and he's got a big picture of Ronald Reagan on the wall, and I can't remember the exact quote, but he says in effect, like, those people aren't in charge anymore. People don't really want that anymore. This is a new Republican Party. To your point, I refuse to believe, and maybe this is projection or wish casting. I've been guilty of that before. That there's not a constituency in the country for sort of traditional movement style conservative ideas. I guess I'd ask, one, is that right? I mean, is there still sort of an appreciation for, a desire for the kinds of policies that Ronald Reagan implemented as president? And two, where are you on this ideological journey? Have you changed your positions on a variety of issues? I think some people could say like, oh, look at Liz Cheney went on Rachel Maddow and beat up the Republicans and the Republican president. She's now a left winger. Are you?
No. Look, I think that the extent to which my policy positions remain unchanged, and that feeds, for example, the very real concerns that I have about the threats we're facing today globally, and my concern about the Republican Party. While I think Donald Trump is clearly an existential threat and one that we have to defeat, I think there are other aspects of what's happening in the Republican Party today that are really dangerous, one of which is this rising sentiment of isolationism. And, I am very much a Reagan Republican. I believe in strong national defense and limited taxes, limited government and low taxes. I mean, I think fundamentally those are the policy positions that caused me to become a Republican in the first place. And I think that what we're seeing today in the Republican Party is, if you think about what's the most conservative of all the conservative principles, those of us who are conservative hold, what's the most conservative one? The most conservative one is fidelity to the Constitution. That's the bottom line. And the Republican Party of today has abandoned that. Too many of the elected officials have said, you know what, if we have to choose between Trump and the Constitution, we're choosing Trump.
What about the Democrats, though? I mean, I look at Joe Biden, and I think you and I probably share many policy views. And I think he's been an awful president. Let's not polish it. I think he's been a really bad president, particularly if you believe in limited government. You look at spending, you look at student loans, you look at his foreign policy. Do you think he's been a good president? And if not, shouldn't you be out there beating up Joe Biden and pointing out all of the problems that he's causing the country?
Look, I think, in fact, the policies that the Biden administration has adopted are so bad that it's why the danger of Trump is so great. Because I think what happens is, you have people who look at things like, the fact that our border seems to be completely wide open. I think just yesterday or the day before, we had more illegal crossings than we've had in any other day, in history, since they've been keeping track of the numbers, if I understood the headlines correctly. The extent to which the Biden administration came into office and has decided that they're going to try to sit at the table with Iran, that they haven't responded to the attacks that we've been seeing, on our forces and our allies in the Middle East. There are a whole bunch of really big problems with the policies of the Biden administration. I'm certainly no defender of those. That's why I'm so concerned, because I think what's going to happen is that you run the risk that you have independents who say, those are really bad policies, and we don't like Donald Trump. We don't like what he stands for. We don't like what he's done, but we don't really, if we have to pick, we're going to go with Trump. And people are going to think he's an acceptable alternative. And I think that's what we really have to guard against. Is I wish the Biden administration policies were not what they are. I think it's really dangerous and bad for the country. I don't know what the choice is going to be next year in terms of who the nominees are going to be. I think people need to recognize we don't know that for sure yet. You can say what's most likely, but we don't know for sure. But that's one of the reasons why I'm spending so much time trying to get people focused on the real danger that Trump presents, so they don't think of him as an acceptable alternative.
What do the people who cheer you on from the left say when they hear you say things like that? I mean, you are a sort of darling of the left. There's this strange new respect for Liz Cheney. I know, I've been there a little bit. What do they say when they hear you be that critical of Joe Biden?
I mean, it's interesting, because I'm sure you've heard this too, that quietly Democrats are concerned about Joe Biden, and concerned about whether or not he can beat Trump. And you look at the polling, and I think that there's a sense both on the left and among those of us who aren't on the left but who know the threat of Trump, that can Joe Biden beat him? But I think in addition to that, there's a sense, and I don't think I'm being just idealistic. I know this is how I feel about those on the left with whom I would never have found myself working in the past. I do think that there's a real sense of like, look, we got to put partisanship aside. And yeah, we disagree on a whole bunch of things from a policy perspective, but we have to work together to make sure that we don't allow somebody to take power who is going to unravel the republic.
So 2 more quick questions. Picking up on some of the headlines today, the article that's at the top of my inbox right now is from Politico's Jonathan Martin, and the headline is, "Where are the Republican leaders?" And he goes through a series of Republicans he's talked to. He was out at the Hoover Institution. He has Jim Mattis, former defense secretary, saying, in effect, we have an obligation to be quiet. Joni Ernst said she didn't want to speak up because she didn't want Iowa to lose its first in the nation caucus status, so she didn't want to be critical of Trump. And Jonathan sort of ticks through a number of these things. Then there's an editorial in today's Wall Street Journal. This is Friday, saying, in effect, the real potential risk with Donald Trump is that he would be bad on policy, wouldn't be able to implement what he said he wants to do, and it might present political problems for Republicans. I'll just read the end of that. "We think American institutions are strong enough to contain whatever designs Mr. Trump has to abuse presidential power. The danger for Republican voters to consider is that his chaos theory of governance would result in a second term that failed to deliver on his promises and set up the left for huge gains in 2026 and 2028. It seems that people aren't you're sounding the alarms and people aren't listening. Republicans seem not to be listening. Is there anything more that you can do to get people to see this the way that you see it?
Well, I think that there's several different things there. First of all, there's no cavalry coming here. So everybody who understands the threat has to speak up. The idea that, and I haven't seen Jonathan Martin's reporting, but we've certainly been living through this period of time where a lot of Republican officials, most Republican officials sort of say, I'm going to sit on the sidelines. They can't sit on the sidelines in 2024 if they really want to ensure that this country continues to be characterized by a peaceful transfer of power. That's what's at risk. And, whether you're talking about elected officials, whether you're talking about former appointed officials, everybody is going to have to speak up and, frankly, work together across party lines to defeat him. I also think that it's really important for people to understand the claim that the Journal is making about the institutions of our government is just not true. We saw that the institutions held on January 6th and to post the election of 2020, but they only held because there were people in place who made sure they did. Donald Trump will not appoint those same people if he is elected again. He will, not have Pat Cipollone as his White House counsel. He will not have Jeff Rosen and Rich Donahue at the Justice Department. He will appoint people like Kash Patel, who has threatened directly on Steve Bannon's show in the last 48 hours that, in fact, they are going to use the CIA to go directly after their political enemies, their enemies in the media. They'll appoint people like Jeff Clark at the Department of Justice, like Steve Bannon. So I would say to the Wall Street Journal, it's nice to be able to say, to make yourself feel comfortable by saying our institutions will hold. But if you have the most unstable, radical, craziest people appointed to positions of ultimate power, those institutions won't hold. Donald Trump will not obey the rulings of the courts. He will offer pardons to people who work for him, who might express concern about taking action that he's telling them to take. And the notion that the separation of powers will help stop his most radical behavior is actually completely unsupportable. If you look at the Republicans today who control the House, the Republicans today in the Senate, people like Mike Lee and Josh Hawley, who have thrown away their allegiance to the Constitution in order to embrace Trump. And so, it might make people feel comfortable to think we don't have to worry, but they need to really step back and think about what are the specific things that actually could prevent Donald Trump from doing the worst. And they shouldn't have any confidence that in fact, those individuals are in place.
Yeah. You've said in other interviews when asked about your own political plans that you aren't ruling out a run for president. Are you going to run? What would be the factors in your decision-making on whether you're going to run? And if you run, how confident are you that you wouldn't pull from Joe Biden or whoever the Democrat is, or further split the vote in a way that would enable Donald Trump to be president again?
I think that's a key question. I haven't made a decision yet about what I'm going to do next year. I think that the fact that people are talking about and thinking about, third parties, whether it's me or anybody else, tells you how much sort of the tectonic plates of our politics have shifted. And my approach and my view to this is, look, we have to do everything it takes to make sure that we defeat Donald Trump. If I felt confident today and I could say, absolutely, I see somebody out there that I know can defeat him and will be a good president, then I would be backing that person. And what I do know is I'm going to do everything that I can, both in terms of at the presidential level to make sure we defeat him, as well as working down ballot to make sure we defeat election deniers. And so I guess I don't view this as much through the lens of what am I going to do or not do, as how do we put together the kind of coalition and alliances that it really are unprecedented that it's going to take to beat him next year.
Liz Cheney, the book is Oath and Honor, a memoir and a warning. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Steve.